Good evening. Welcome to the Camden County Mayors Association Community Forum. My name is Tom Barbera. I'm the mayor of Laurel Springs, and I'm the president of the Camden County Mayors Association. Other officers of the Mayors Association in attendance tonight are the first vice president, Teresa Brunella. Teresa. She's the mayor of Brooklawn. Our second vice president is William Richardson. He's the mayor of Waterford. Bill. Our recording secretary, Barry Wright, mayor of Winslow. Our corresponding secretary, Gary Passanante, our mayor from Somerdale. And most important, our treasurer, Phyllis Magazoo, the mayor of Berlin Township. The Mayors Association is presenting as a public service tonight's forum on the proposed marijuana legislation. Our panelists tonight are attorney William J. Caruso from Archer Law, Police Chief Leonard Check of Berlin Township, attorney Richard T. Wells from the Garrity Law Firm, Garty Law Firm, Dr. David Nathan, he is the board president of the Doctors for Cannabis Regulation, and Mr. Richard Todd Edwards, who is the political action chairman of the New Jersey NAACP. And tonight's panel discussion is moderated by Mayor Gary Passanante. I'm turning it over to Mayor Passanante.
Thank you, Mr. President. Welcome to Somerdale, and thank you all for coming out. Just a few housekeeping items, and first a few thanks. I want to thank Sterling High School, their board and administration for allowing us to use the facility. They were immediately responsive in saying, let's help out. We are here to communicate with the public, and thank you again for being so generous and allowing us to be able to use the facility tonight. I also want to thank the Mayors Association. They're just a great organization that represents the mayors of Camden County, and I want to thank them for their vision and insight into holding this forum because we really believe as our local elected officials that our job is to communicate with our residents and to make sure we understand, what they want, because quite honestly, we were elected to lead them and their wishes. So this is a really, I think we're on the eve of some historic changes in this state. This is an important legislation, one way or the other. There are folks out there, I'm sure, that are in favor, and there's those that are against. And we understand that. Tonight is not about speaking for or against. This is not a pro or con assembly. This is really for information. And we've gathered experts together to relay as much information as we can tonight. And as you know, or may not know, this has been a pretty dynamic topic and things are changing on a daily basis. So, what we're going to tell you tonight is the best we know as of this moment. The legislation that we're going to be speaking about literally came off the press yesterday afternoon. So it is the latest that we know of, and between now and when the proposed vote will take place, which is this coming Monday, it could change again. So what we're telling you now, don't hold to be gospel. Just know that it's as accurate as it can be tonight. Our panelists, we've tried to put a diverse group of panelists together that will talk about various areas that as mayors and as residents we should be aware of as we move forward, if and should this become law. And we're going to touch on a number of areas, and we are going to have a period of question and answer. One of the things we did was when you signed up registered for it, we did ask those that may have questions to submit those questions. And I've got a list of questions here that we're going to make sure that we address for those that took the time to submit them to us in advance. After addressing some of those questions, we will open it to the audience. There's going to be a couple of mics roaming around that you'll have an opportunity to pose your question. But let me make it very clear. You know, this is a communication forum, but we're not looking for people to get on their soapbox and make statements. We're looking for questions, and we're going to try to answer those questions. If we don't have an answer, it's not because we're trying to hold it back. It's because we flat out don't have it. But we will make a note of it, and that will be an answer we will try to get to you as fast as we can. As I mentioned, things are changing. So, you know, what we think we have in our hands today may be different by tomorrow or by Monday. So we'll do the best we can to provide accurate information. But again, if you're going to start providing a soapbox presentation, we are going to move on to the next person. We need to address questions because there's a lot of them, and we want to give everybody the opportunity to get those questions answered the best we can. So hopefully you all understand that. Again, we're going to try to keep this interesting and communicative. We'll do our best we can. And again, thank you, mayors, for coming out and for supporting having such a forum. So with that, I want to introduce our first panelist. Bill Caruso is with Archer Law. He is one, in my opinion, I'll express my own opinion because I'm up here and I can, one of the foremost experts in what's going on in Trenton. He spends more time in Trenton than he probably does home with his family. And, you know, when we need to get answers about what's happening with laws and bills out there, Bill's the guy who can answer them. So Bill is going to give an overview of the current legislation. And just so you know, we were sent this copy yesterday late afternoon. I spent the evening, a long evening, reading 176 pages of a bill.
Sideways.
Yeah, I turned it around first. So it is a very, very complicated bill. And that's why I'm trying to make sure everybody is clear that we're going to do our best to answer as much as we can, but there's a lot of dynamics going on. So Bill's going to go over this bill, and then we'll follow up with our panelists going forward. Each will give a small presentation, and then we're holding the most of the time for Q&A later on. So hopefully we're clear, and with that, Bill Caruso.
Thanks, Mayor. Thank you all for being here today. I just want to credential myself real quick before we begin, because I think it's important, because I'm among neighbors. I do a lot of these forums, and I've become, I guess, one of the state's foremost cannabis experts or advocates, not by choice or design, just sort of got there. I grew up here in my adult life working for Rob Andrews. I was his chief of staff. And I then became a staffer to Joe Roberts in the Assembly, and then on to Sheila Oliver, who's now our lieutenant governor. And during that time, from like 1997 on, this topic, I watched its progression, medical into legalization and the development. Post-government, I'm a dad. I'm a dad of 3 boys. I'm happily married to a wonderful woman who has counseled me every step of the way to not get myself in trouble, including on this issue. But I'm also a member of this community. And so this is a very difficult topic. This has been going on in a lot of different jurisdictions in Colorado and California and other countries, by the way. And so my advocacy, and I put that in quotes, really was about trying to get in front of this a couple years ago, and I've worked with a bunch of folks on this panel here to get it right as best we can because we saw it coming. This is, in some ways, we looked at as an inevitability of what's going on in other states that would ultimately come here, and then to figure out if there's a way to do this in a way that would protect public safety, deal with some of our teen use issues, deal with some of our other addiction issues, and then potentially have some economic benefit. This legislation we're going to talk about today is not perfect, and I could sit here and explain to you all the flaws. I'm going to explain to you as best I can how we got here and where this legislation intends to go, and I think all of us will be able to answer some of the questions about some of the problems and some of the benefits. But I'm not here to advocate, I'm here to inform tonight. But I also want you to know that as a member of the community, as a father of 3 boys, as somebody that lives in Berlin Borough, my goals are, in everything I'm trying to do, both in my governmental life past and my previous and my current life now, is how do we do this right? How do we get things better? And I think, I see a lot of the public officials nodding out there. That's generally how you come to your job every single day. We don't have all the right answers. We try to do the best we can. And this is an example, I think, of that, of trying to get ahead of something that may be coming our way and fix it. But you're going to hear a lot of the problems, and you're going to understand that not every problem is solved here today. So with that, why are we here? In 2009, the state legislature, in its wisdom at the time, decided to pass a medical marijuana bill for the first time ever. It was groundbreaking in not only in Trenton and in our state, but throughout the country. Jersey was a leader in this effort. The court of public opinion has changed drastically on medical marijuana. At the time in 2009, there was not a lot of support and science attached to it. We're still lacking some of that science, but there's a lot more support now than ever, and there is research to match it. But our program languished for over a decade, or about a decade. And it created with it some significant problems related to veterans seeking help and other people that needed help, children seeking help. And the law has morphed a little bit, but it also created a demand. It created a demand for people that wanted help and wanted the ability to seek this relief, and they couldn't get it. We're looking into the black market and other places. Fast forward to 2014, Colorado jumps into an experiment, and many people looking on the sidelines thought that this was going to be a nightmare. All of the issues that potentially could go wrong, people were talking about. And there were. There were issues related to homelessness. There were issues related to there were issues related to licensing. There were issues related to concerns over driving while intoxication. And there were a lot of concerns over dosage and issues related to marketing to children and packaging. This was a brand new industry that no one had dealt with. And remember that this is one of the most challenging places you're going to operate, because you're without question, no matter what you're doing, operating outside of federal law. Medical or recreational cannabis are illegal under federal law. So everything we're doing in any of those spaces is now illegal, and it presents unbelievable challenges for employers and other things. But Colorado was chugging along, and a lot of the problems that they were encountering, they started to develop. So a lot of other states started to examine this experiment and see where it was going, and Jersey was no slouch. Although at the time, and I'm not trying to be partisan, we had a governor who had absolutely no desire to even look at this. Governor Christie was adamant. I worked very closely with Governor Christie. I'm a Democrat, but I worked across the aisle with the governor, and he was very clear with us. He had no intention of expanding to legalization. So movements formed in New Jersey to start pushing for what this potentially could look like in advance of the next governor coming. I joke, at the time that New Jersey started looking at Colorado, most people thought the next governor was going to be named Steve. Steve in the north or Steve in the south. I have my preferences. But we got a guy named Phil instead. But Phil Murphy was educated by a lot of the efforts that were going on both in state and from out the state. So this legislation that you see in front of you isn't just some, throw it against the wall and see what sticks. It is built off of a lot of the lessons that have been learned, not just from Colorado and other jurisdictions. It is also built off of our lessons here in New Jersey, that we started down a path on medical to help people, and we had to stop because of politics. And we had to pull back because of bureaucracy. And I see my friends in the audience who are patients that are nodding, and it hurt a lot of families. The other side of the coin, which may be a little dicey to talk about, but we can't have this conversation without talking about the money. And I want to be very clear here. This is not life-changing money for this state. This is not life-changing money for your communities. This is money that will help. We're talking about $300 million in a $39 billion budget. That's a comfortable estimate of what potentially could be raised here on an annual basis. That's some programmatic funding at the state level, but that's not going to solve our pension crisis. That's not going to solve our property tax crisis. So anyone that tells you here, and I say this as an advocate, that, oh, we should do this because of revenue, it will generate revenue. It has generated revenue in other states. It is not going to change anything in Trenton, really. And in your communities, you will have the ability to tax, and my friend Rich Wells is going to go in a little bit of that when he gets up. You will be able to have the ability to tax these entities now, different than what you've been able to do in the past. There's a separate tax, but it's not life-changing money for your communities either. That shouldn't be the rationale for doing this, and I will say that to you today. It is absolutely not the rationale. So, The bill on the docket for Monday is the state's first legalization effort and will be historic in this sense on a national level. It will be the first time that a state legislature passes a statute to legalize cannabis in the country and create a market. Vermont legalized it, but they didn't create a market for this or any rules. It basically just said, we're going to legalize it, you can do what you want, but we're not going to create rules for growing, we're not going to create rules for what towns can do and can't do. We're just going to basically say, if you got it, smoke it. Probably not the right way to say it, but we've chosen to do it differently. New Jersey's chosen to create a market and establish a market and create rules and create clear rules for what municipalities can and can't do. So first thing off the bat, I don't want to step too much on Rich's effort, we started from the premise that this is a home rule state. Mayors get to decide what happens in towns. Mayors, council, your governing body. That can't change. We can't mandate that you do this. And I'm not going to spend a lot more time on that because I think Rich is going to talk to you about some of the specifics on why that is, but that was a premise in the bill, and I like to say that for the most part that was carried out. Secondly, and the only reason why I use that as the first one is because we're here at the Camden County Mayor's Forum, but the paramount concern to promote this legislation was for racial and social justice reasons. Throughout the history of cannabis enforcement, we have had a disparate impact on minority communities. There is no difference statistically in use of cannabis. By the way, folks are wondering what cannabis is. I get that question a lot. It is not the stuff that doesn't get you high. That is different. That is called CBD. Cannabis is the term that has been adopted now to refer to marijuana because marijuana has had such a toxic connotation over time, and in some forms has been viewed as racist, so we use the term cannabis. Frankly, in lawyer and lobbying speak, it's the clean way of saying it, right? It's a PR term. So if you hear me say that, it's just interchangeable for marijuana. We have been locking up black and brown people at an alarmingly high rate comparatively to our white counterparts, and the facts cannot be disputed in that respect. However, we're not going to fix racism by legalizing marijuana. It's just not going to happen. It is a rationale, though, for deciding why we should legalize. And there have been discussions about why don't we just decriminalize cannabis. Well, here's a problem, and Dr. Nathan will get into some of this as well. If I go around our communities right now, our children can access cannabis. They can get it on the street. In jurisdictions that have legalized, teen use has gone down. Some will argue because the stigma, it's not cool anymore. I don't believe that. I think I know why, and I think the research shows. It's hard facts. It's behind a store counter and you can't get it. These facts are not disputable if you look in these jurisdictions where each of these places the teen use has gone down. It's because we're taking it away from the black market dealer to some extent. Depends on what we do with the market, by the way, and we'll come to that in a second. But you put it behind a store counter. So taking decriminalization at its face, you don't really solve that problem, right? You now actually say to the street dealer, it's okay, keep going. And they don't have any rules. The second issue comes, decriminalization in your communities doesn't stop the potential racial profiling and or the criminalization of this because you are still stopping people and fining them. If people can't pay those fines, they end up back in the criminal justice system. This new law has taken away the illegality for possession and some sales of cannabis now. They have still dealt with penalties, though, for juveniles. There was a debate over this. Well, we shouldn't lock up juveniles, and we're not. But we can't tell juveniles there's no penalty because that's the wrong message. So this legislation struck a balance to create a legal effort now where adults 21 and over may possess certain amounts. Sales will be legal provided they're done in the manner set forth in the bill with a proper license in accordance with the regulations. And children under 21 will be treated the same as they are in possession of alcohol. So they will not have this scarlet letter on the record. Say one other thing. Expungement is a big piece of this. Expungement of criminal records. This became a major piece of this legislation, this package. And there's a reason for that. If a child is arrested, or an 18-year-old or a 20-year-old is arrested even if they don't go to jail, and most don't, the true facts here are most people that are guilty of a cannabis crime don't go to jail. You have to be a lot of possession, a significant amount in trafficking. But they still have this blemish on their record forever. And expungement is a very difficult process. So this effort focuses on making sure that we can get these people back in our economy. You can't get a student loan if you have a marijuana conviction on your record. You can't get a job in some places because you have a marijuana conviction on your record. And so for those reasons, we have chosen in this legislation now to expunge the records for folks that have had previous convictions for both sales of a certain amount as well as possession, because we thought it was the right and fair thing to do. This may not have anything to do with the cannabis economy. We may be helping the next future banker, the next future cashier, or the next Bill Gates, you don't know. But we're gonna give kids a fair shake now to get a clean record and go back without a lot of jumping around. The last piece I wanna talk about is the economic development. This bill does a lot to create a market. I don't know if it's perfect. It's a lot of experimentation of taking different things that work in different jurisdictions. They tried to create a new commission which will form. It'll have jurisdiction over where we're going next for licensure, but it creates a balance between a medical market that will continue to exist, and that is a growing market, and the legalized recreational use market that will have certain requirements for local representation, so we have a Jersey flavor to this. There are constitutional impediments about, we have to have 30 licenses for minorities. You can't write that in, but there are incentives in this bill that create diversity in this market. And there will be, I think, a focus on making sure that we don't have a glut in the market. One major problem we've seen in other states is if you have too much too soon, you have a real black market problem. And we are trying not to recreate that here. So there has been some careful attention to that in this legislation. Again, I can't say it's perfect. I can say to you that there was careful attention paid to it. So this bill is up on Monday. If it passes, it will go to the governor's desk. And then there will be a regulatory process where this new commission that has to form, there will be new members appointed to it. They will be political appointees that we're all, likely familiar with in terms of how that process works. Generally, they will have some expertise in this area, and they will be in charge of drafting the regulations going forward, and then we'll see how this program develops. But this has been a long process. This has not been something that's taken a couple weeks. This has been going on for many years. In fact, there are people in this audience that have probably been advocates for decades. But it is not going to be perfect, and this will require many more regulatory and legislative changes as we go. But the goal here is to start and get a start on this and provide a baseline so that Jersey isn't last. We're certainly not going to be first, but we can do this in a way that's safe and that it's right if we can. And we'll see what the legislature decides on Monday. This is obviously still a tight vote, and I'm looking forward to answering questions when we come back later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. Again, when we're finished with the initial presentations, we will open up for Q&A. There should be plenty of time for that. Our next panelist is one of our locals, Chief Leonard Check. He's with Chief of Berlin Township. He's also the current president of the Chiefs Association and certainly an expert in public safety, and he's going to be speaking about that aspect of it. Chief, please.
Thanks. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mayor Passanante, Mayor Barbera, and the members of the Camden County Mayor's Association for the opportunity to speak tonight. I'm Chief Leonard Check of the Berlin Township Police Department. I'm also the current president of the Camden County. I'm also the current president of the Camden County Police Chiefs Association and a member of the New Jersey State Association of Chiefs of Police Working Group. This was a working group that was formed several years ago to investigate all the available research as it relates to law enforcement and the legalization of recreational marijuana. And I'm here tonight to share some of that information with you. With the legalization of recreational marijuana, our officers are going to have to be trained and learn how to refocus on impairment and not just possession. They will have to attend advanced training classes for drug driving investigations. Although there are similarities to drunk driving, there is a distinct difference in the way that we will have to enforce drug driving laws. Departments will have to send officers to drug recognition expert classes, advanced roadside impairment driving enforcement training classes, because officers are much more experienced with DWI investigations involving alcohol than they will be with drugs. Investigating officers will be a critical witness to these cases and will have to attend court, report writing, and mock trial classes. This training will be critical to mount successful cases against defense arguments about marijuana and drug driving. Alcohol is unique among impaired drugs in that there is a documented correlation between blood levels and the levels of impairment. That does not exist in other drugs, and it has been shown to be non-existent for THC and marijuana. Currently, it is not possible to identify a valid impairment standard for marijuana or any other drug equivalent to the 0.8% BAC limit in alcohol. This training will be costly to towns, and towns will have to bear the initial cost for the training, overtime, and any equipment. Local municipalities will have to then apply to the state for reimbursement for money spent for law enforcement officer training and equipment. And I also had the opportunity recently to attend the LEAD conference. LEAD is an educational program that many law enforcement agencies in New Jersey use to teach children about the harmful effects of drugs, alcohol, vaping, and gangs. And much of that conference that we just attended focused on strategies and the impact on our children and strategies to educate if recreational marijuana is legalized. As I just stated, a major safety concern will be the increased impaired drivers on our highways. New Jersey is one of the most densely populated states with a large amount of motoring public. We understand that the data collected is related to a relatively short period of time in which marijuana has been legalized in certain states, but that information is clear that the legalization of recreational marijuana will negatively impact the motoring and pedestrian community. Some of the information that we have found was the percentage of traffic that's related to marijuana doubled in Washington State the year retail marijuana sales were allowed. In Colorado, marijuana is now involved in 1 out of every 3 deaths on the road. Combining marijuana with alcohol appears to increase impairment dramatically beyond the effects of using one substance alone. In a recent study conducted by the National Highway and Traffic Safety Administration concluded that Colorado and Washington State THC-positive drivers now exceeds alcohol-positive drivers. In Colorado, there are more marijuana dispensaries than McDonald's and Starbucks. Currently, there are 35 states that have medical marijuana laws. And currently, there are 10 states plus Washington, D.C. that have recreational laws. And there are 50 municipalities throughout New Jersey that have passed ordinances banning or limiting dispensaries within their communities. And arguably, marijuana has been referred to as a gateway drug. With the opioid epidemic that we are dealing with in New Jersey, we have concerns that recreational marijuana will add to this problem. If the perception of harm goes away, we feel the use will go up. So in my opinion, law enforcement is not yet fully prepared for the legalization of recreational marijuana, but as you all know, we are not responsible for creating these laws. We will enforce the laws that are passed to the best of our ability, and we as leaders will make sure that our officers are trained and will have the tools needed to do their jobs and keep our communities safe. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you tonight.
Chief, thank you. I think most can agree that the biggest challenge we have ahead of us is the public safety aspects of this, and whether you're for or against it, it is a big obstacle that and a hurdle that we're going to have to overcome. And there's costs associated with it, and there's going to be time spent, and it is going to be a whole different world we're going to live in if this becomes legal. But we have folks like Chief Check and all of our public safety support folks that are staying on top of this as it transitions, and hopefully will be prepared the best they can, and we'll get the support from Trenton to be able to be properly trained and equipped for our sakes, because obviously as a municipality we have to be concerned about the costs associated with it. So Chief, thank you again for coming out and sharing your information. Our next speaker is Richard Wells with the Gardy Group. He's going to be talking about zoning and land use, and that's another really important aspect when we get past the public safety aspect. One of the things the bill calls for is that once, if the bill passes, each individual municipality, their governing bodies will have to decide whether they will allow the facilities to operate in their towns. It is a opt-out type option. One of the things that both the League of Municipalities and the Conference of Mayors were lobbying for was to have it as a opt-in, but the legislature has kept it as an opt-out. So in layman's terms, what that means is if the law passes, automatically it will be legal in your towns until and unless your governing body chooses to, through an ordinance, determine which of the facilities, if any, are legal and can operate in the town and cannot. So it does come down to the local level, and that's where the zoning and land use side becomes an important factor, because as part of that decision, if a town decides that they want to allow growing, let's say for instance growing is something they want, they got to decide where they're going to allow that growing to take place. And the statutes are not dictating at this point where that goes. It's being left for us to make that decision locally. That's why it's important that we have conversations like this so that we have your input and we can make the right decisions that you asked us to do when you elected us in these positions. So zoning and land use is a really important aspect. So Richard is going to get into that part of it and the do's and don'ts and what will be available to us as local elected officials to decide on the zoning aspect. So Richard.
Thank you, Mayor. And good evening, everyone. Again, Richard Wells from the Gardy Law Firm. I've been practicing land use and redevelopment law primarily for the last about 6 years, and in doing that, I largely advise municipalities on how to do land use and zoning. Part of that practice, I've gotten a lot of questions recently about what do we do about cannabis. So land use and zoning has become a really important aspect of the law from the public sector. And before I get into kind of the elements of the bill that have to do with land use and zoning at the local level, just a little bit for the audience about what that is, what that type of law encompasses. Land use and zoning literally controls what goes in your backyard. It controls everything from where you can put a fence or a garage to large-scale developments, and whether a warehouse can turn into a strip mall or whether you have a hotel coming up in your commercial zone. It's also the reason why many municipalities have concentrated main streets with commercial districts and also concentrated residential districts. It's the way I kind of boil it down is that it's the reason why McDonald's doesn't build a store across from your house. It's the way to separate and identify which uses are appropriate for a specific municipality, how they're appropriate, and where they are to go. So with respect to cannabis, that boils down to yes or no. Do we want it or do we not want it? But that question goes a little bit further, because the legislation we have here doesn't just say, yes, you can permit it, or no, you can prohibit it. It allows you to really dissect the various aspects of the industry. So if you feel that your municipality could facilitate, for example, a growing facility, but that really commercially a dispensary is not acceptable, you can do that. The legislation lets you say yes or no to each sector of the industry. It lets you say where, how, and importantly, it also lets you say how many of those particular licenses you would like to permit within your township. Now, depending, again, on the characteristics of your township, you might say yes to all, no to all, or yes to some, or partial no. If you're not sure, and you say, you know, we want to permit some, but it lets us permit a number, and we're just not sure what the number is, that's not a reason to panic. You don't have to say, we want to permit 5, or we want to permit 1, because the state licensing agency that will be in control of issuing these licenses in municipalities also looks at population and demand. So if they see that a certain municipality has permitted, let's say, dispensaries, but they haven't put a cap on that, the state isn't going to license 20 dispensaries right in the downtown because they realize, listen, this town is only so big, the population and the demand is only so big, so we're going to do that licensing appropriately. It just allows the townships to say, let's try this out, maybe let's try one or two, or let's try a few, depending on what our commercial and retail districts can facilitate. And in doing that, just a quick note to the mayors and other solicitors who might be out here, it does draw a very kind of fine line between permitting one or two dispensaries or grow facilities and spot zoning. So if you are considering only permitting one, it's very important that you consult your land use and your municipal solicitor to say, listen, we're not trying to violate the municipal land use law and get involved in a spot zoning dispute. And just briefly, spot zoning means that you really regulate one or two properties to the benefit of that property owner. So again, if you're looking to permit only a certain cap of that, you do have to be careful about avoiding a potential spot zoning challenge. So with that being said, with saying yes or no, or partially yes or partially no, as the mayor pointed out, the big question that we get is how does this opt-in or this opt-out provision work? What do we do? How do we have to do it? The first thing to note is that this legislation actually voids existing ordinances that ban marijuana facilities in the township. So if a township has already enacted an ordinance saying, no, we don't want to permit any adult use or recreational facilities in the township boundary, that ordinance actually becomes void and they have to act again. So that is important to note for townships that may have already done something. You're not necessarily in the clear. You have to make sure that you review this legislation, go through the full inquiry, and then take action based upon that. So what you do need to do, if you want to say no, if you want to say yes, is you have to act within 180 days after the Cannabis Regulatory Commission creates its regulations. And that's an interesting change in the prior legislation because originally townships were required to act just within 180 days without having seen some of these regulations that might regulate proximity, regulate number of facilities and things like that. So here we do get a chance to see what the final regulatory scheme will be before townships act one way or another. And that I assume will answer a lot of questions that people have about proximity, number of licenses, and how that can be regulated from that standpoint. If you do not act within 180 days, what happens is that your existing zoning ordinances basically take control. And that means that growing, processing, and wholesale facilities will be permitted in your existing industrial zones, and that the sale of the marijuana will be permitted in your, as a conditional use in your existing commercial or retail zones. Now, I know that might sound like an easy way to do things. You might say, well, you know, our zoning ordinance is pretty strong. I think we're just not going to act and let the legislation take its course. The important caveat to that is that if you do not act and you're kind of imposed this permissible use on your town, you're unable to prohibit it again for another 5 years. And that's important because townships change their zoning laws not infrequently based upon new uses and the dynamics of the township. So if you decide to say yes and you think your zoning ordinances are strong, it's important to actively take that action anyway, because you won't really have the opportunity to say no for another 5 years. And that also would apply, in my opinion, to a partial yes. If you want to say yes to one facility, I would still, explicitly say no to the other facilities so that no argument could be made that, well, you didn't act with respect to this, so we're going to try to impose that upon you. Another question I get with respect to the opt-in or opt-out is, if you say no, do you then have to say no every 5 years? That's not the way the legislation reads. If you say no to partial or all of it, you don't have to say no again unless you want to change your ordinance. And again, another question is, if you say no, do you have to wait 5 years to say yes? The legislation doesn't read that way. So if you decide to prohibit the industry from entering your town, but maybe some advocates come in or maybe the town changes its mind, then you still can say yes. It's only if you fail to act that you're imposed with this 5-year timeline. So with that being said, there are a number of methods that you can actually say yes or no. The easiest and I guess the fastest method that some townships may take is to just amend your ordinance. List the specific uses that you want to permit, in which zones, and kind of leave it at that. I suspect that some towns that have very detailed ordinances may do that. It's an easy and it's a quick way to clarify that yes, we are permitting these uses in these zones. Another way to do that is through conditional uses. What conditional uses are is that a township is saying this use is permitted if they can meet all of these conditions. And we find that a lot in towns that might have, for example, parking problems. They might have problems with lighting or noise or things like that. And they want to make sure that if a certain type of retail or commercial business is coming into their boundary, that they meet standards that are specific to that town. And that allows you, again, some really local control to say that we want to permit it, but only if the things that are specific to our township are met. And the third shouldn't be underestimated is redevelopment agreements. A property owner might come in and say, you know, I have this vacant space, potential warehouse development, and that the township recognizes that it's within a redevelopment zone. You can still incorporate these uses and these businesses into your township through redevelopment agreements. That again gives you more latitude to impose pilot payments, impose other conditions of satisfying the agreement so that business can remain in the town. An important note about stating whether or not a township wants this use within the boundary is that only the zoning board can actually state what is and what is not permitted within the boundaries. I've had a couple townships ask me, well, can't we just pass a resolution saying that we deem this a pharmacy use and that it's already permitted in our C1 commercial zone? Well, that's actually beyond the scope of what the governing body is permitted to do. Only the zoning board is permitted to make the determination of whether or not something is permitted in the zone. So if a township wants to take that route and say, listen, we think we've already got this, it's permitted as either a processing use or a retail use, make sure that the zoning board is the entity that actually passes that resolution interpreting the land development ordinance. Now, the governing body can, of course, state that they agree with that interpretation, or if they disagree with it, they can always amend the land development ordinance as well. Part of permitting it or considering permission of the uses in the town is also proximity. We get a lot of questions about how close these things can be to schools, to parks, to daycares, other public facilities. And the answer to that is that it's not in the legislation currently. Our existing alternative treatment centers are actually governed by regulation when it comes to proximity. So not the statute, but the regulations that are passed by the Department of Health state that these ATCs can't be in drug-free school zones. And I suspect that we'll see the same thing once the Cannabis Regulatory Commission actually comes out with a full scope of regulations, that it'll be the same way, that we'll see these various proximity regulations there rather than in the actual statute. I think I'm running close to my time, but I'll try to get through one or two more points quickly. Some other miscellaneous aspects of basically local regulation that don't specifically have to do with land use, but are in interplay with land use as well. The statute permits local municipalities to have their own licensing process. Now, with anything, a local law cannot frustrate the purpose of a state law, but that usually is seen in the scope of business licenses. You know, if you want to get a business, you register with the state, but you also apply with a municipality. And a municipality is allowed to have their own licensing process to an extent. The specifics of that, again, can be detailed later, but that goes in terms of fees for the license, in terms of what has to be submitted, guidelines that they have to follow, and ultimately the state will as well send these applications to the municipality. So if you don't feel like enacting a licensing process, you're not going to be in the dark. You will get a copy of the application. it will state where it's supposed to be, and the municipality will have the opportunity to review that and state, yes, this is accurate, it is permitted in our zone here, or you can point out things that might not be included in the application and say, listen, they didn't disclose that there's a school around the corner, we're not going to send this favorably back to the state. So you do have that aspect of local control as well. Two more points that I'll hit quickly are public and private consumption. Again, that does have a little bit of land use implications in it. With respect to public consumption, our smoking laws already control. So if you can't smoke somewhere with respect to tobacco, you can't do the same thing with marijuana, and that also applies to vaping. Now, there is an interesting addition to the bill that I call basically public highness. We do have regulations and laws against public drunkenness. There are also provisions in this legislation permitting a municipality to enact ordinances prohibiting public consumption of cannabis in manners other than smoking. So if you have somebody high as a kite on edibles walking down the street, you can actually find them, cite them, deal with them accordingly, just like you would someone who was drunk out in public. And the last bit is private consumption. There's been some questions about how these manners of consumption can be regulated from a private perspective. And property owners can actually prohibit private consumption to an extent. I'll answer some questions on that later. I'm sure there's a few, but there are some caveats and exceptions to that. But under certain circumstances, private property owners can also limit consumption, both smoking and non-smoking. So I think I've overstayed my welcome. I'll try to answer some questions later on, but thank you for your time.
Thank you, Richard. I just want to reiterate a couple of really important points, particularly for our mayors and elected officials, the council out there. Two critical things. One, our zoning boards, or if you have a mixed land use board, joint land use board, are going to need to take some action. However, with the latest iteration of this law, we will have the luxury of being able to see what the regulations look like before we take action. Prior to the latest change, we had 180 days to take action. Now it's 180 days from the release of the regulations, so that we'll at least get a chance to see what this regulatory commission will come up with as far as rules and regulations, and then decide how we want to proceed from there. But just remember, one way or the other, you really need to take some action, because if you've passed ordinances, they're no good after this, if this were to become law. The second thing is, I know that there were a number of us mayors that were talking that were under the assumption that this was a carte blanche, 1,000 feet from any public facility and school and all of that. That is not the case. So if you are thinking that you are in a community that cannot host a facility and you don't need to do anything, that's not the case. So we need to see what the regulations look like, and then we're going to need to take action on our land use boards to make sure that you have them where you want them, because there is no prohibition. It's funny, they do have a prohibition of advertising within 200 feet of a school, but there's no language in there about having a facility within 200 feet of a school. So it's being left to this commission that's being established to decide what can and cannot be done. So please pay attention to those two things, because they will be issues on our plates in the future. Our next speaker is Todd Edwards with the NAACP. Todd is going to really review some of the civil rights aspects of it, some of the economic aspects, because we've kind of hinted around on the opportunity of economic development. There was mention about redevelopment areas. In some towns, this could be a huge opportunity if they see fit to be able to turn vacant buildings into something productive if they choose that they would like to do that. So there is, certainly things to be paying attention on the economic front. So with that, Todd.
Thank you very much. My name is Todd Edwards. There we go. My name is Todd Edwards. I'm the Political Action Chairman for the state NAACP. We have 41 branches in all 21 counties. Our president of the NAACP is Richard Smith. He's also a national board member for the NAACP. People automatically think that we would have automatically jumped right on board and been in favor of legalization of marijuana. We're a civil rights organization that's 110 years old that basically started in a church. So for us to go to our organization in 2015 and say, we want to be on the committee that talks about legalizing and decriminalizing marijuana, they looked at us like we had 10 heads. But our philosophy was, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. So, and that's a true statement in life. So in the very beginning, Bill will tell you in 2015, I believe it was, we started together with this, and there was no social justice aspects part of this bill whatsoever. When we talked about expungement, Senator Scutari laughed and was like, Lord Jesus, we're trying to get pot legal, and now you're talking about expungement. So I'm just going to take a second or two to show you where we've come from. Literally, when I say nothing social justice in it, it was nothing. Now we have expungement that includes up to 5 pounds, that when it initially started, it was under 50 grams or less. So when we fought and we got it raised, and it affected 80,000 to almost 100,000 more New Jerseyans from us fighting that battle. Resentencing, provisions allowing those eligible to have their sentences reviewed, dismissal of pending marijuana charges, scaled license fees for minority communities, provision micro licenses. Someone spoke earlier about impact zones. Impact zones are the designated zones in underdeveloped, impoverished areas that we can get different rates for, and they're looking for these businesses in those zones to bring ratables and bring things back up in your community and hopefully in our community. There's no bar on those with previous marijuana convictions to become in the business. Graduated civil penalties for underage possessions up to an ounce. We don't want, in Colorado, it went from the adult black males being 3 to 4 times arrested, like it here is in New Jersey, to the minority children, then started getting records for possession, and the targeting started going to that. So they have great language in that. It took 7 years in Colorado for the first minority-owned dispensary. We're not going to have that here in New Jersey. Like Bill said earlier, I think this bill is doing it right. I'm not supposed to support or be against it, but we definitely had input. I think we're not going to fix racism with cannabis, like Bill said, by all means, but I think that we're at a very good place that we're going to help people who have been stigmatized and incarcerated and have had the negative connotations of being marijuana users or sellers to be a productive citizen again, and not just have, and the truth of the matter is, rich white men profit on it on the backs of the minorities when it was affecting us in our communities. So, and I give the legislators, I mean, they've come a long way, and I appreciate all the support that they have done. We're not done yet. Monday is still coming, and we're here if there's any input from the crowd during the questions and answers, or you have things that you would like to see us try to do. It might be a little late for that, but we would love to answer any questions you guys have. That's where we stand.
Thank you, Todd. Our last presenter is going to be talking about the public health perspective, obviously another big issue that we're all concerned about. And Dr. David Nathan is our guest speaker. He is a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and clinical associate professor of psychiatry at Rutgers. And he's going to really dig into some of the public health aspects, tell you the facts about what this means to all of us and our kids, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Nathan.
Thank you. Am I on? Oh, thank you very much, Mayor. Let me just give a little bit more of an introduction to myself. So as the mayor said, I'm a psychiatrist from Princeton, originally from Philly, and I am a father of 2 teenage kids. I am Also the Director of Continuing Medical Education for the Princeton Healthcare System, which is now Penn Medicine, Princeton Health. And I'll note that on the subject of cannabis policy, I do not represent the views of Penn Medicine, Princeton Health. So you all heard that, right? And my employers have been great, but they do want me to make that distinction. So how did I get into this? Well, you know, what is a psychiatrist doing talking about, you know, possible change in policy? And I want to be, in the interest of disclosure, very clear that I'm coming from the perspective of regulation. The organization I represent is Doctors for Cannabis Regulation. And from our perspective, in order to have regulation, you need to have legalization. So I am unashamedly on the legalization side of things, so just so everybody knows that. At the same time, the organization that I created, Doctors for Cannabis Regulation, is in our mission statement committed to really showing both sides of the issue, because not all of the evidence supports the point of view that cannabis legalization is going to be a universal good. And that's an important thing that we make note of, because we don't want to exaggerate or minimize anything about the health effects, positive or negative. So that's where I'm coming from, and you'll decide whether you think the information I provide is really sufficiently neutral and following the evidence. So I got into this because in medical school I thought that the harms of the drug war were worse than the harms of the drugs in certain respects, and that was especially true when it came to cannabis. And so in 2014 I was asked by the NAACP and the American Civil Liberties Union, both of those groups in New Jersey, to join the campaign New Jersey United for Marijuana Reform. So I did, and I made it my job to talk to doctors about this and get all my friends to join in, thinking that my friends, who mostly said, yeah, the illegality of cannabis makes no sense medically. And I said, okay, great, it's time to speak up, and they didn't want to. So I was left in a bit of a quandary, and I found that there are national prominent doctors who do feel the same way, but there was no organization to represent them, and that was the inspiration for DFCR. So we launched in 2016 with the publication of our Declaration of Principles, which you guys can find online at dfcr.org. And we'll lay out the case for our public health view and social justice view of cannabis policy. That was followed up by our platform of regulations, which is a list. This is actually not the most updated one, but on our website you'll find the most updated version that is a list of about 7 principles that every legalization bill in the country should have in order to protect public health and ensure social justice. So about half of those things are about public health, of course, specifically about trying to prevent underage use, about good government oversight, testing, labeling. We also talk about education of adults about the use and misuse of cannabis, and an education of underage would-be users about the potential downside of cannabis use. On the social justice side, our platform of regulations really attacks the issue of poverty, because if there is one effect that we know we have had from the drug war, it is poverty. It has been the inner cities that have really suffered the burden of enforcement when, you know, the ratio of arrests is 4-to-1 and between blacks and whites. And I know one thing that people on both sides of this issue, and there are good people on both sides of the question of legalization, something we all want is to eliminate racial disparities in arrests. We also all want to eliminate the illegal market in cannabis, which, as the illegal market for any drug, can be dangerous, and it's obviously untaxed, it's unregulated, and it can be violent. So we all agree that we want to eliminate these problems. That's obviously where and how we do that, that we differ on. So in our platform of regulations, we talk about taxation of the cannabis trade, and where that money should go in terms of helping to fund research and fund education. We look for protection of small businesses, and that's also to try to help help communities that may not have access to the same capital that many from Wall Street would have. We also want to ensure diversity in all aspects of the industry. That goes along with expungement of records and resentencing for those still serving their time. And inclusion of minorities in this industry is really key to righting the wrongs that we perceive about how it has gone with the prohibition of cannabis. So with that in mind and all of those disclosures in mind, I'd like to talk about a few of the key issues that I know are always on people's minds about this, and something that I obviously still think a lot about and I'm constantly trying to get more information on, because there's always more information than I've read and there's always more information coming out. So first, an overview of adult recreational use. The majority of adults are unharmed by the occasional use of cannabis. They may have a very unpleasant experience in using it, but as many of you may know, cannabis is not lethal in overdose. That is not the case for synthetic cannabinoids that actually can be quite dangerous. And the reason they came around was because of the illegality of cannabis and the legality of these new compounds. They're now mostly illegal, though it's kind of whack-a-mole for the DEA and FDA to try to keep up with all the new compounds that come out. So for adults, the majority are unharmed. There are certain at-risk populations of adults that should not use cannabis and for whom cannabis can be a problem. I'm a psychiatrist, so it happens to be that 2 out of these 3 groups fall within my area of expertise. One group is people with certain psychiatric illnesses. Now, you'll hear that cannabis can be helpful for PTSD. There's lots of anecdotal evidence for that. There's not so much, good prospective controlled research on that, but there's not much good research on anything about medicinal cannabis because of its illegality. But you hear about it used for PTSD, and that's true, and the studies are kind of mixed on that. You hear about its use for anxiety. I'm actually a bit of a skeptic on that, but I'm a bit of an outlier for people who know about this. So there are other people who really think it's much better. For people who are predisposed to psychosis, whether or not they've ever had an episode, but if you've had a relative who ever had a psychotic episode, and therefore you are genetically potentially at greater risk, cannabis has the potential to trigger or to exacerbate a psychotic episode, and that can be very serious. What we don't know, and if you hear people say to the contrary, I am telling you they are going beyond the evidence. What we don't know is whether cannabis actually causes psychosis in people who are not otherwise predisposed. So that's very important to keep in mind. There is a percentage of people, it's about 1 or 2% in the country, who are prone to psychosis, and using cannabis can be a very destructive thing for them. Those are adults. Second group is people with a history of addictions, and this is interesting because there are 2 different ways to look at the use of cannabis in addiction. One is as an exit drug, and already somebody here has told me about how their child used cannabis as an exit drug from opioids, and you hear a lot of that, and I don't think people are lying when they say that. At the same time, the studies are not yet there. There are studies showing that in medically legal states, that opioid use and opioid overdoses and opioid prescriptions, both measured by Medicaid and Medicare, are down some percentage. The overdose deaths are down about 25%, and you might think, well, but those are the states that legalize it. Of course, that could be a sampling thing. But they actually take a look at the deaths before and after and what they would have been expected to be, and you do see the numbers go down. You also see a decrease in prescriptions by about 15% for opioids. And a number of other medications, by the way, including certain psychiatric medications. And I can tell you, I'm not sure how I feel about that because I think that cannabis can have more side effects than some of the psychiatric medications we prescribe. And so that second, so people with a history of addiction may use cannabis as an exit drug. I certainly think they shouldn't be prevented from doing so legally, which is part of my point of view on the whole issue of adult legalization, that people should be allowed to make their own choice given the relative non-toxicity of the drug. There are also people who have a history of alcoholism or some other kind of substance abuse, and if they use any kind of recreational drug, it will whet their appetite for the other drug that they were interested in. And I've seen cases of that as well. So it's not a clear-cut thing, the degree to which cannabis is going to be beneficial or harmful to the issue of substance use in this country. My guess is for people with opioid misuse, it's going to be beneficial. For people with other kinds of substance misuse, like alcohol, benzodiazepines like Valium, it could be actually a negative. We're just not sure. But it is, of course, less addictive than those other drugs. Okay. I'm not going to talk a lot about the medicinal use of cannabis, not because there isn't a lot to say, but it's kind of beyond the scope of today's discussion of adult use. Also, I will say that my perspective on cannabis legalization has little or nothing to do with its medical uses. You know, we have medical cannabis in New Jersey, that's great. As of the past year, my father actually is using medical cannabis, which, growing up with a dad who was in the Army in the early 1960s and watched the Beatles from Fort Bragg, seeing him vaping cannabis is really just blowing my mind. It's still, I can't get used to it, but it's actually helping me a great deal. He has Parkinson's, and it's helping his dyskinesia, and he has chronic pain, and he thinks it may be helping with the pain, but it certainly helps him sleep, and it beats the heck out of the hydrocodone that he was taking to sleep before that. So there are medicinal uses, but even if you are a doctor or a civilian who believes that there is no good medical use for cannabis, I still believe it should not be against the law because of the relative balance of the harms of the drug versus the harms of the prohibition. Now let's talk about the two areas that I do think are more problematic. So for adult use, I think our country is going to be fine with adults having the legal ability to use cannabis. Our country would not be so well off if underage use goes up. It's already high, and in fact, underage use of cannabis has been, well, it went up for about 40 years up until the past 5 or 10. It has leveled off, which is interesting because that's the time it's become legal for adults. At the same time that alcohol and tobacco use have been falling steadily for decades. And it's interesting to think about which of those drugs are legal for adults and which of those are not. I think it's really a lot about youth education that is preventive. Let's talk about why we need to educate our youth, and that is because cannabis in underage use, even when you control for all of the extraneous factors about, what kind of home the kid's growing up in, what kind of circle of friends they found themselves getting into, what kind of problems they may have had before they ever started trying any drug. It does look like that cannabis is an independent risk factor for potentially cognitive issues and motivational issues in young people. Not all young people. We all know the guy who, smoked marijuana all through school and got a PhD and is now, smarter than any of us. It's probably not, cannabis is not much of a performance-enhancing drug, but it often does leave people untouched. The problem is you don't know if your kid or if you're a kid, are going to be the one that's harmed by it, and the only way to find out is the hard way, and that's not what you want to do. What I tell young people, and what I advise you guys tell young people is, with them trying it, even trying it, saying, well, I'm not going to use it, I'll just try it one time. There are two possible outcomes to that. The better outcome is that you hate it, that you get paranoid and that you get dry mouth and blurry vision, and you insist that your friends take you to the ER, and now That's the better outcome. The worse outcome for underage users who are not using it medically is that they love it, that they fall in love with it. Because if that's the outcome, then you're not going to just be using it once before you're 21. And that's what I try to really convince young people. And I think that resonates with young people because for me, this is not a moral issue for young people. It is not a moral issue whether young people use cannabis. It is a health issue, and it should be kept that way. And you know, the literature that we distribute, and I say we collectively, society and the Substance Abuse Health and Services Administration of the United States and National Institutes for Drug Abuse, they publish the literature that you see outside, and I would say I agree with about 50% of everything I see in here, which is good. I used to agree with about 10, 20%. It's been going up, and it keeps going up because they're getting warmer. They're getting closer to really reflecting, first of all, what it is that is important for kids to know, and they're getting their facts right more, which is nice. They're still sounding preachy. And I don't know if there are any teenagers out there or anybody who was a teenager at some point, but teenagers don't like being told what to do, especially if there's a I told you so argument in it. If they don't see a reason for them to abstain from something, they're not going to do it. It doesn't matter what the law says. And that's why I don't think law is really the important factor in trying to convince kids not to use it. You know, I don't want my kids using cannabis. I don't want them arrested for it if they're 20 years old and get caught with it, and I think that's something that is important to remember when we think about the graduated penalties for underage use. I think that we need to recognize the fact that kids do these things, and the best way to handle it is not criminally. I mean, maybe you want to slap them on the wrist, but the more important thing is that we figure out what the heck's going on and why, if they keep getting themselves in trouble, that's happening. And if it's around cannabis, if it's around other drugs, that's the issue. So our education needs to be evidence-based. It needs to be in the language that teens will respect. And it also needs to take out not just the morality, but the hyperbole. Looking at the literature that was handed out back there, talking about how cigarettes make you go bald. First of all, I'm not a smoker. I will say that. So it wasn't the cigarettes. You know, it's not that useful because most people who smoke cigarettes don't go bald. And so it's not helpful to tell kids that. It is helpful to tell kids that even if they're vaping, the odds of them vaping for a couple of years and then being able to stop is very low. And something that the tobacco companies know, and this is another thing to repeat to your kids, for any substance, if you can make it until you're 21 years old and not use a substance, the odds of you becoming dependent on that substance go way down. And that's important. So actually something that this gets right is that in adults, the occurrence of dependence on cannabis is something like 1 in 9 people, right? 1 in 9, about 11%. For comparison in terms of prevalence, not in terms of necessarily comparing the two drugs, that's about the percentage of people that are dependent on caffeine, of users. So people who use caffeine, about 11% are dependent. Same with cannabis. If you are underage and use cannabis, your odds of becoming dependent go from 1 in 9 to 1 in 6. And so your risk really goes way up, and that's not surprising because if your brain is developing and you're putting a drug into it on a regular basis, your brain's going to get used to it. And you're not going to have a lot of choice about whether you continue it beyond a certain age. And that is why we try to prevent underage use of everything. And that's also why the other point, what was the other point? I'll skip it, I come back to it. Why you want to prevent underage use and why, oh well, I lost my thought. Okay, I'll talk about driving under the influence. That to me is the biggest concern about cannabis legalization. You would think it would be underage use, especially if you have 2 teenage kids who say that it's easier to get cannabis in school than it is to get alcohol. Oh, and a point I did want to make about underage use. You know, we say that we're really afraid of kids starting to use cannabis if it's legal because, you know, clearly it's going to be everywhere. kids already have access to cannabis. I don't know if you guys are aware of that. But the government's own statistics show that 80 to 90% of 18-year-olds, my son included in the 80 to 90%, say that it is easy to get cannabis at their high school. And I don't think anybody should really be surprised by that. But what that tells us is it's not an access issue for kids using cannabis. If they're using it, it's not because, oh, suddenly, they legalized it or they made it, they were permissive about it. It's everywhere. And it has been for a long time, and it's not going to go away. I think one of the issues is when cannabis is against the law for everybody, as it has been for the past 82 years, the implicit message to kids is that it's harmful to everybody. And kids know that's not true. The things that I told you about adult use and those small populations that shouldn't use it, and the majority that really don't have a big problem with it, they know about that. They have access to the internet, another thing that parents should be aware of. And that was supposed to be funny. No, it didn't work. Okay. So they have access to the information, and if we want to sound credible to our kids when we tell them it's bad for them, we need the law, in my opinion, to reflect the reality of the potential harm, and that is that, coming back to the other thing, below the age of 17, we do not know of any safe age or any safe frequency of use for cannabis in kids. Above 17, it seems to be less harmful. The brain is mostly finished by then. You'll hear people say the brain's not done developing until your mid-20s, but that's, your brain is never actually finished developing, so you can't really declare a simple number. But most of the physiological brain development is done by the time you're 21. Most of it's done a little earlier than that. We got to pick an age, and I like 21 because of the decreased risk of addiction. And our state got that right. Canada, by the way, did not get that right. And my organization in Canada suddenly found itself to be the conservative voice of change up there because they made the legal age 18. I don't think that's a great idea. All right. So we want the law to reflect the reality of the science because we want kids to respect the science. We also want them to respect the sanctity of the law. In alcohol prohibition, a major problem was the kids started drinking because they were thinking, well, my parents are drinking, it's illegal for them. Not a great message. DUI. Like I started to say, though, because cannabis use in the legalized states seems to be underage cannabis use seems to be level among the youngest population, may actually be trending downward, but we don't have enough data to really say that with confidence. The big problem is that as Chief Check, I knew it was something really cool, and I was sure I was going to remember it, because how do you forget Chief Check, right? As he was saying, there is no good per se test of cannabis use. The only drug, as he said, that has that is alcohol, and thank God for that, right? And I say thank God for that because the impairment you get from alcohol is far worse than the impairment you get from other drugs. And it's not just cannabis in that category, it's the opioids, the sedatives, even the stimulants can all be correlated with an impairment in driving, or let's say that, people who use those things have a higher rate of accident, whether it's causal, whether they're third variables, we don't know. But alcohol use increases your risk of accident if you're at 0.08 about 12 to 15 times. Not surprising, how many people do we know that had accidents when they were driving drunk? Drug use, including cannabis use, is more on the order of about 2 to 3 times. So that's an increase. Not everybody is impaired by cannabis when they drive, just like not everybody is impaired by opioids when they drive. But you have to make the assumption that driving under the influence of anything is potentially hazardous, and so we need to draw a line. And where I think we need to draw the line is exactly where Chief Check drew it, which is that we need more drug recognition experts. And I think that some of the revenue should go to drug recognition expert training, and I'm happy to say it is. If I am correct, right? Yeah, it's already happening. And so that's in the bill. That's good to hear. We need that because that's about the best we can do right now. Will it eliminate the problem of racial bias in enforcement? Not necessarily. And that's unfortunate, but we got to do something because we can't just say, oh, well, people drive under the influence of drugs and we just have to live with that. Something I would caution you when you hear people saying that cannabis increases your risk, and you see it in the legalized states. What you see in the legalized states is that people in fatal accidents, people in accidents who are tested, a greater percentage are testing positive for THC. What does that tell us? That tells us that they use cannabis at some point. It doesn't mean they used it before they got behind the wheel. And so we don't have real answers. If anybody says they know that cannabis increases the risk by a certain amount, definitively in the legalized states, that is going beyond the evidence. The evidence does not tell us that. Again, there is evidence that it can impair driving. We don't know whether drug driving rates are going up in legalized states. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons is that there's some evidence that people are drinking less and smoking more before getting behind the wheel. And like I said, drinking is really a lot worse. Not to say I want people to smoke and drive, just to be clear about that again. But, you know, accident rates could go down if people drank less. That's really the major risk factor. So we need to train the DREs. We need, I can talk about a number of issues. Actually, one more thing I want to just touch on before I stop. There are a lot of questions you can ask about decriminalization in public health, other issues in public health. The gateway question: does cannabis lead to the use of harder drugs? There is a correlation between the use of cannabis and the later use of hard drugs. So people who use cannabis have higher rates of later hard drug use. People who use hard drugs have higher rates of prior cannabis use than people who don't use hard drugs. So there's a correlation there, right? There's also a correlation with alcohol, and there's an even stronger correlation with tobacco. So the question is, do all these things make people, do the soft drugs make people graduate to the hard drugs? That's something that this one gets mostly right, I will say, and I'm really happy, because until recently, NIDA, who published this, has been saying that the gateway thing is real. And I'm here to tell you that, to the best of my knowledge, the gateway theory is not a thing. There is no evidence, there has never been causal connections between cannabis use and the later use of hard drugs that looks causal. All we have is the correlation, and it's not very surprising that the use of soft drugs precedes the use of hard drugs, right? And so people who are using hard drugs at some point were exposed to the other drugs, and they would have used those first: alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis. They also drank soda, but that doesn't mean that the soda made them use the hard drugs. And the great majority, the vast majority of people who use cannabis never go on to use hard drugs. So this booklet actually got that one right. The other thing that can be an actual causal connection between cannabis use and the use of heroin and meth and every other hard drug is that the people in the illegal industry who are selling cannabis may also give you free samples of the stuff that actually makes them a lot more profit, and that is the hard drugs. You know, they're easy to carry. They have a huge markup, and they'd rather use those because that generates a lot of repeat customers, right? Heroin use, they're coming back. So if you can get them on cocaine, heroin, meth, they're going to be consuming a lot more of your product than if they're going to be buying cannabis from you. And so the sale of cannabis being linked to the sale of hard drugs is a really bad thing for public health. And so that obviously speaks to my point of view on this issue. There is something that does explain a connection between the use of all drugs, the use of people who use heroin are more likely to use meth. Even those drugs have nothing to do with each other, complete, almost opposite effects. What is the connection? The connection is encompassed in this idea, and you guys should all Google this, the common liability theory. So people who still really want to hang on to that gateway idea and thinking, my cousin, he smoked pot and then he was using heroin. I know that the pot led him to use the heroin. Well, what we know is that the use of all drugs is related to a certain set of risk factors. And what are those risk factors? And they're not going to be very surprising. A lot of it is genetic, and I know this because when I broke my arm and my ribs teaching my son how to ride a bike, that's not how it's supposed to work. I had to take Percocet for the first time in my life, and it was the greatest thing ever. Felt awesome. I felt great, and I was looking forward to the pill every night. Couldn't take it during the day because I was working, but at night I could take it, and I just looked forward to the pill. And after a week, I realized that the pain was getting better, and I was still looking forward to that pill. And I found out after that we have opioid dependence in the family. So there are those genetic factors. There are cultural factors. So if people are of a certain cultural background and people drink a lot of alcohol, then they're more likely to have a problem with alcohol. That can also be genetic factors, but it can be cultural. The other risk factor, so that's not a lot you can do about, whether you're Irish American or whether you have a certain genetics. You have to keep it that way. Did I say something wrong? Jewish American? I'm Jewish. So you can't change that generally. What you can change is the risk factors that really seem to make the biggest difference in the common liability theory, and that is poverty, absent parents, family disruption, educational deprivation, unsafe streets, so when the kids are going to and from school, it's not safe. Those things create the kind of stress that get people to use drugs. And so if we really want to tackle the drug problem, there are two approaches. One is educational. We got to do a much better job than we did, for example, with the DARE program. That actually, studies show, had negative effects on drug use. It actually increased drug use in long-term studies. And we have to do better in terms of fixing the problems that lead people to use drugs in the first place, and that is through social justice action. I'm going to stop there, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Doctor. A lot of interesting information that you've shared with us. So now we come to the point where we're going to open up for some questions. What I'd like to first do is address a couple of the questions that came in from those who sent them in advance. We're going to have individuals out there with microphones that will allow you to ask your questions when we start taking those. When we have questions, I'm going to ask you to do a couple of things. One, give us your name and your town, and primarily because we have mayors here from towns all over, and I know they'd like to know if their residents and constituents are interested in this topic. I know I am, and so that's the reason for asking that information. Nothing more, nothing less. Also, please keep it to a question. Again, we do not want to get into a debate. This is not about that. This is about information. And I ask you to respect that for everyone here and for our panelists. So with that, we'll start off with a couple of the questions that were predominant. We got a lot of questions, and so what we did is we kind of summarized into a handful of ones that were most often asked. And I'll pose the question, and then one of the panelists that feels best suited to answer that question is I ask you to step forward and provide an answer. As Bill Caruso said, that's what I'm always asking for is answers. Correct, Bill?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right, so can condominium rules or leases not allow marijuana smoking in or around apartments or houses? I think we sort of got an answer on that already, but let's clarify that one more time.
Sure, thank you, Mayor. So the short answer is yes. Condominium associations can prohibit that. Again, if smoking is already prohibited, then that applies to the smoking and vaping of marijuana. I touched on it a bit with private consumption. If you're the owner of a condominium unit and you want to rent it out to somebody, you cannot prohibit private consumption in your own unit. So that's where the distinction comes in. There's a couple more exceptions that have to apply to multifamily homes and things like that. But generally, if smoking is prohibited, yes, it's already prohibited for marijuana and vaping as well.
Thank you. All right. We'll mix in some questions from the audience while we're covering some of the ones that were sent in. Question? Sandy.
My name is Caroline Doherty. I'm from Gloucester City. My question to whoever could answer this, since marijuana is a Class 1 illegal drug federally, would federal funding of, that our municipalities receive, as well as our school districts, be affected by the fact that it is legal in our state? Because in Colorado, I do receive emails from one of the, I guess, a safeguard or a newspaper that monitors some of these things. A teacher was fired because she was taking municipal, I take this back, it wasn't in a state that it was legal, but medicinal marijuana. She was fired on the grounds because her contract says she cannot use illegal substances, even though it was a prescribed substance, because the school district received federal funding.
Sure.
How will that affect all these municipalities and school districts in New Jersey?
Sure.
Thank you.
There is nothing in this law that we're doing that we're doing at the state level that will impact federal law for obvious reasons. We can't change federal law right now. This is illegal at the federal level, both for legal adult use, recreational marijuana, and medicinal. And we're not, and frankly, as some of us said, we have a medicinal program already operating in New Jersey. Unfortunately, right now, if you have a job that is related to any type of federal licensing, you could be and may be at jeopardy if you're consuming either recreational cannabis or medical cannabis. Some of that is starting to change, although we are not able to impact that here directly. This is changing at the federal level, and I'll say two things to you. If you have a CDL license, right, or a truck driver or something like that, or school driver, if you work in some type of federal law enforcement, if you are a heavy crane operator, you are not only not allowed to use cannabis on the job, but you may not be allowed to use opioids and other things because you're tested for those. And it's for safety, for the safety of the person and also for other folks on the job. I just want to state, because I thought you were going on this, there is nothing in our state statute or anything at the federal level that will impact a municipality if you're getting CDBG funding or things of that nature because you've adopted a cannabis ordinance in your town. We have not seen any evidence of that where, the federal government's going to claw back money or cops in school programs or anything like that. That's not impacted. But your question about personnel, it is a tough problem right now because of the absence of federal law here. Here's the good news. The market does modify itself. And so I've had the privilege of speaking on this for some time, and I've talked in the insurance industry a lot. And originally, a couple of years ago, they won't hear any of this. Today, the insurance industry, particularly in the workers' comp space, has figured this out. It's cheaper and safer to treat patients and get them back to work quicker if you're treating with cannabis products. So they're exploring ways to be able to reimburse patients rather than cannabis companies. They don't want to pay cannabis companies. They don't like that look. And they're using their federal lobbying power now to change the federal laws. So we may get to a place now where you not only may see some recognition at the federal level, but you actually may see both public and private insurance potentially covering this on a medical side. But I want to be very clear. The education that goes on now in Colorado and other places that have legal jurisdictions, and almost every state, Chief Jack, you did great with the stats, because it's like 35 jurisdictions now with medical and 10 at least with legal rec. There's an education effort that goes on to tell people, if your job says you can't use cannabis, you can't use cannabis. And that comes down to some extent personal responsibility. On the legal recreational side, I don't have a lot of sympathy, and because it's a personal choice. The medical patients really are in a jam right now because you're picking your health and safety and your wellness at a doctor's recommendation over your vocation, and that's just because of the problem with federal law. There's nothing that we're doing here, though, that's going to be able to impact that one way or another.
Thank you. All right, another question here. What is the tax revenue allocation for local municipalities, state, et cetera? I guess it's back to you, Bill, again.
So there's a secret in this bill that I'm not supposed to talk about that's a benefit to the municipalities. First of all, for the tax rate, to answer the question, for this bill, for the first time now includes four different rates. 3% tax on retail, a 2% tax on cultivation, 2% tax on processing. That's the manufacturing side of this, turning things into edibles or topical creams and things of that nature. There's a wholesaling license you get a 1% on. And you can aggregate all of these, and there will be no tax on medical going forward. They're phasing out that tax. One other thing that they've done, and I have a little bit of experience, my friend here has a lot more in this in terms of, and certainly my mayor friends know this, fees. There's an inherent ability to assess fees at the municipal level, but that's dicey sometimes. You have to justify those. It's always nice when the statute's clear, and the statute is. The statute does allow municipalities to also assess fees in addition to tax rates. So there's a couple pots of money, notwithstanding what other efforts you work out with your company that's coming in with the town. There's other charitable efforts that things will do, or donate a park or things like that. That's separate and apart. But you have the ability to tax, you have the ability to levy fees. Here's one other thing that we didn't talk about here that you also have the ability to do. You have the ability to do a lower tax rate. And what we've seen in a lot of innovative places right now is towns have developed their own types of overlay programs. The state, and this was lobbied for, originally they weren't going to allow you to lower the tax rate, they were going to lock you in. You can lower your tax rate below a 3 if you want to attract certain types of companies to come into your town, but you can tack on other add-ons, entrepreneurship programs, hire from within programs. And we've seen that type of innovation in other jurisdictions that have gone on where they've said, we're going to have a little bit of lower tax rate, but we're going to require you, cannabis company, to hire our employees 20%, 30% from within our town. We're going to make sure that you have an entrepreneurship program that you'll graduate out some of your employees to become future owners going down the line. So we've seen innovation where you've actually reduced a tax rate, but you've gotten different benefits out of it, and that's based on the community. I mean, I'm sitting in a room here where we have quasi-urban, suburban, all sorts, very rural. Camden County is an interesting melting pot, and different mayors may want different tools, but you've been granted the ability to have the local tax rate in this.
Thank you. Questions? Mayor, do you have somebody there?
Chief Cormany, Waterford Township Police Department. I could obviously, I have concerns from a law enforcement perspective, many obviously, but I do believe that we'll have a seat at the table, and I think we're going to work through that. I think we've been guaranteed that, and I'm happy about that, so I think we'll work our way through this together. I do have another public safety concern of a different sort, though. In 2012, Lawrence Berkeley Laboratories did a study, and they found that 1% of the nation's electricity was consumed by indoor grow facilities from legal marijuana in the handful of states that were legal at that time for medical and legalization. At that point, if obviously it was a tax on the utility grid, I think everyone in this room knows that we have a very antiquated and weak utility grid here in New Jersey, as we've experienced from time to time. Has there been any study on the impact that this mainstream grow facility in New Jersey, having these facilities, will have on our utility grid? And is there any plans to upgrade that in any way to keep that from happening? I'm sure if we're letting everybody get high, they're going to want refrigerators and TVs to work, or they're going to be really mad. So,
Chief, I got to tell you, every time we're part of one of these forums, I always think that we've heard every question, and thank you, because that's a novel and new one. Here's what I can tell you that I know. First of all, this legislation puts a cap on grow facilities. There'll be a total of 28 for the first 18 months, and then the commission has the ability then to decide if they want to add more. That's become, by the way, a whole bugaboo on the internet. People are like, oh, there's caps in this bill. 28 grow facilities in 18 months. I mean, my goodness gracious. How long is that? That's going to take a while to get all these pieces open. I think that's actually a safe starting number to figure out for issues like you're raising, how big this is going to be, what the problems are going to see. I can tell you of the 6 that are here right now, so there are 6 facilities here right now that are growing. We've heard of nothing related to any energy demands or needs. There are 6 new that are being cited right now. I'm working with one. I have a client that's they just got a license. They're down in Vineland, and they're working right now. But the power, water needs that they have are sufficient based on what they're already in a facility that they're going into. They're taking an old warehouse and just reconverting it. They haven't asked for any special new power needs or anything like that. I have not heard of any issues here in our state, any of the power utilities saying that this is going to be a problem for them. In fact, I think they're licking their chops in some ways, ready to go. But we have not seen that. But I think the way this program's structured, it's given very broad authority to this commission to grow as they see fit. And the commission that hasn't even been formed yet, but this is going to be a crawl, walk, run kind of process, not just a gunshot start to just, let's have 100 facilities, or as the chief said, there's more cannabis facilities or operations than there are McDonald's. We're not looking to have that right now. We may get to that at some point, but that's not where the vision is right now.
That's good to know we're starting out slow. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Chief.
you. Sandy, I think you had, did you have somebody?
Hi, my name's Mike Cannon. I'm from Laurel Springs. And I'm curious if anyone on the panel believes that on account of legalization, there will be some kind of uptake in the numbers and frequencies of adults using marijuana. I think if you go around the county, you can go into any non-corporate convenience store and you can see the rolling papers and the smoking apparatus there to purchase. Somebody's getting high. You really believe there's going to be a bunch of new people getting high? I mean, anybody that wants to get high can get high. If you want to find marijuana, you can find it. Just because it's available in a store, you think that sober, abstaining people are suddenly going to want to try this new marijuana thing out of the blue?
Well, I guess the question is, are there statistics that show or project what change this might have on our population?
There are statistics, and the statistics show that in the legalized states, adult use of cannabis does go up. So it's not going through the roof. Big secret is that most people don't like cannabis. I don't know if you're aware of this, but most people who try it don't continue to use it because it's not for everybody. People tend to prefer alcohol over cannabis. And I'll tell you, as a public health issue for adults, that's an unfortunate fact. But that's the way it is. So adult use does go up. To, again, put some things in perspective, they're looking at young adult use because you would think that that would be a big bump. First of all, the largest bump is, can anybody guess? Seniors. Yes, seniors are the most rapidly increasing group, thanks to my dad, I think. So that group's going up very quickly. Young adults, also the use is going up for people in their 20s. The problem is, and I don't know how this happened, but the government, when it collects statistics on drug use, the category is 12 to 17, and then 12 to 17, and then 18 to 25. Well, you're straddling both sides of the legal age for, almost all the drugs. So that's a problem. We've got statistics showing that age group seems to be staying a little steady or going up a bit. But what it doesn't tell you is whether it's the 18 to 20-year-olds or the 21 to 25-year-olds who are using it more. My guess is it's the latter because it is adult use that seems to be going up in the legalized states. Underage use level, the youngest group seems to be going down, and it's interesting because normally the underage use of drugs tends to track very closely to perceived harm, and perceived harm is not going up in the legalized states yet. For the youngest group, yet the use of cannabis is going down. And so my guess is, like I said, the younger people are getting the message that what is safe and acceptable for adults is neither safe nor acceptable for young people. So the numbers are going up. And that's also, by the way, why for sure we're going to see the numbers go up of percentage of drivers who are testing positive for THC, because more people are using it. Doesn't mean they're driving stoned, it just means they're using it. And we know that from the legalized states.
Thank you, Doctor. Okay, another question I have here, and then we're going to go to the back there. Who can grow, and is growing allowed? We didn't talk about that, but let's make sure we're clear on that.
So this was a big fight, and there is no home grow allowed in this bill. And I will tell you, on a personal level, I don't really think somebody being allowed to grow 6 plants in their home is a danger to anyone, okay? But the problem came, it became too hard. And if you look at the problems in other jurisdictions, and we did, I've been to Colorado, I've been to California, I've been to Las Vegas. Every place we went, we heard of the problems of their either home grow or co-op program. So Colorado did something crazy, and we had this in our medical program. Colorado legalized marijuana and created a market and required you to go get a license. And then people said, well, wait a minute, I want to be able to grow at home. And I said, okay, we'll let you grow at home. And then someone said, I'm too sick to grow at home. I want Todd to be able to grow for me. And Todd said, fine, I'll grow for Bill. And I'm going to grow for everybody else on this panel and everybody else on my block. And next thing I know, I have a warehouse and I'm growing for 100 people. And that looks a lot like a commercial operation. And that cannabis is not going into a regulated system. It's going out everywhere. And now you've created a legalized market to get rid of your black market. You've created another market over here that's not regulated. So when we went out to Colorado, we went with legislators and we went with a group of folks from New Jersey, they said, don't do this. And our legislators listened. And home grow became too hard to regulate and manage. And frankly, from Chief Check's standpoint, you know, the selling point for the chief at some point is, chief, you're going to be able to allocate your officers to other things, right? But we don't want to have to policing who's got 6 plants or 7 plants in their home or their backyard. And it really became a problem. How do we give clear direction to our law enforcement officers? This is legal over here. This is legal depending on how many plants he's got or doesn't have, or what kind of plants he has, or who's got the access to the plants. And I think this is unfinished business. I think that we will ultimately get to some place where people will be allowed to possess and grow personal use in their home, like you can basil or oregano or other things. Or brew your own beer in your house, which you can do. Or your own wine in the bathtub in your basement, if you want. But we're just not there right now, and this is a very sensitive point for a lot of people, that particularly patients that are priced out of the market right now that would like to do that. So it is not allowed in this bill. It will not be allowed in going forward. It has been shut down by the legislature, and I guess this will be unfinished business that will be in future bills.
There are 2 groups that, well, first of all, I did not mention that in DFCR's platform of regulations, this is the only regulation, the only suggested bullet point that has not happened with this bill. Everything else is being covered in some way. You know, we may quibble over whether we like how it was covered, but all the social justice boxes got ticked. Same for public health, except for this one. We believe that home grow should be allowed, and it's for 2 reasons. One is that there are people who have more time than money, and if you're willing to put in the time to cultivate a cannabis plant, which is not trivial, to get it to actually do what you want and yield the drug, you should be allowed to do so to a very limited extent. The other group is there are patients where it's not even an economic issue, it's just an access issue, because if you have one particular strain that really works for you and you can't get it from the dispensary, what are you supposed to do? That's going to perpetuate the illegal market, and the last thing we want to do is perpetuate the illegal market. What Colorado did really screwed up, because the number of plants that Bill is referring to was 99 was the number of plants to be allowed, which is an extremely lucrative number of plants. And so they really blew it on that one, and they had it carried over into the legalized era, and that was unfortunately a big mistake.
Thank you. Sandy, I think it, and then we're going to go back to the mayor.
I'm Sade Benz. I live in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and I wanted to know, this is for Todd Edwards and Mr. Bill Caruso. Mr. Caruso, you said that there's going to be 30 licenses for minorities, but for the micro licenses, I want to know how many will be distributed, and I also want to know what you mean by scaled license fees, and for the 30 licenses, what in your application process, what will make, for example, like me stand out besides me being African American?
I want to be very clear. I said there aren't going to be a set aside for 30 licenses for minorities in this bill, because we can't write the bill that way. However, there are going to be incentives for minorities, veterans, women-owned businesses, New Jersey residents. The impact zones create some set-asides as well that provide added points for diversity and for folks living in operating in those jurisdictions in the impact zones. This commission that's going to get formed, this is the structure and boring law, but it is very difficult to write in quotas into legislation without them being constitutionally challenged. And that's a challenge that every state has faced. In fact, just a sidebar on this for a second. In Florida, they put out all their licenses, and they wisely figured out, as we've joked before, oh my goodness gracious, we gave all the licenses out to all white men. And so they figured this out, that's not a good look, so they gave a license to the Black Growers Association without a process. They just said, we should give one to these folks, and they got sued because there was no process. So the Black Growers Association, who should have had a license and could have had a license, lost their license because of this failed process. So New Jersey decided to create some guidelines, broad guidelines in this bill that aim to get to certain places, and there's some language in the bill about percentages and things, but the commission has to develop, and it's just the technicality and how this works in the legislation. So to answer your question, for somebody like you, and it depends, I always say to folks, figure out what you want to be and where you want to be. You have relationships in your town. You are a local New Jersey person. You may, and I don't know anything about you, may not have any experience with cannabis, but a cannabis company from out west may want to come and interact with somebody like you and pull you into an advisory board or pull you into some senior role in their company, or maybe you become a landlord because you are a property owner in your town and you have a relationship with your municipality. There's a lot of different ways that people in this audience that are interested can interact as New Jersey residents, because this bill created an incentive for people outside of our state to come in and find you. Because in order to get a license, they've got to partner up with somebody in New Jersey that's got boots on the ground in impact zones for at least 3 years, and there's going to be an incentive to have that Jersey flavor involved in their company. So you would be looking for some sort of role, an equity partnership, an officer role in a company, a role in an advisory board. That's not to say you couldn't do this on your own, but that partnership will be, we've tried to incentivize that in a bill to marry up companies that have expertise and capital with people here in New Jersey that want to be in the business.
Thank you. Mayor?
And on the application, application, I guess he's saying points, he's talking about the points. There's a point process.
Yes.
That the applicant, if you have a minority on your board, then it scores you up a little higher. So there's incentives that way, not set aside. So when I was rallying up my community, trying to let them know, every time I would testify, the senators would let me know, make for sure you're not going back to your community telling them that we'll have X amount of license set aside for minorities, because we couldn't. So.
Good evening. Thank everybody for the great information that was put out tonight. My name is Chief William Elias in Riverside Township Police, Burlington County. This is a legislative question. I haven't seen the legislation yet. Is there anything built into the legislation that's going to reimburse municipalities that have spent thousands of dollars to train our canines that are going to be no longer be able to be used after this bill is passed?
Yes, and it was interesting. There were two provisions in this bill related to law enforcement. Chief Check mentioned the first one. So there is reimbursement money in this bill for, first of all, the DRE training program right now is not charged to the town in terms of the training itself, but the overtime and the absence of the officer and it is lengthy. That is, right? That's a burden to the municipality. So this bill takes money, proceeds from this bill, and provides reimbursement there. Secondly, it names specifically in this bill, and I confirmed this morning with the speaker, there is money, there's language in this bill to reimburse for replacements for canines. You cannot retrain canines that have been trained to hit on cannabis. They will no longer be useful. There is some evidence out there, by the way, that those dogs could potentially be repurposed for other reasons, not for drug search and seizure though, but you would have to get a replacement dog for that purpose for other drugs, right? For meth, for coke, for other things. So I can't sit here though, and I want to be very careful with you. I can't say that there's going to be every dog in the state's going to be replaced in the first year because of all this money. The commission's going to decide that, and one other thing I just say, a trick of the legislature that every mayor knows here, doesn't matter what's written in the bill, it's a budget process. And that's good and bad. So we can plus that money up as we go, and I would say this to you openly in this meeting, and I've told your colleagues, we're not going away. We're going to fight for this. We fought for that money in the bill. We fought for that money for DRE training, and we will fight for it in the budget process with you alongside. We're on the advocate side, but we want to get this right. So it's in there. I can't tell you what it's going to look like, though. That's the magic of Trenton. But we're going to fight for it in this budget cycle, and we're going to fight for it in every budget cycle going forward.
Thank you. Sandy?
Sean Ludwig Barrington. You had said that the towns that had already passed ordinances and their planning boards approved it, and we have the zones, we're going to have to do that over again. I just wanted to know, what was the logic behind that, and is that solid now, or is that still in the process before Monday that could change?
Well, you want to speak on this, Rich?
Yeah. So that was, to clarify, that was specifically ordinances that prohibited the use. If you passed an ordinance that permitted the use and you outlined some zones and did some things to that effect, I would still recommend looking at the bill to make sure, consult with your counsel, obviously, to make sure that you're hitting all the points the bill wants you to hit. But it just applies to ordinance prohibiting the use. If you prohibit it, then you would have to go back and enact the same ordinance again.
Yeah, look, I think the safest message here is that if this passes, it's probably smart to see what the regulations look like first, so that you don't have to do this twice. Take a look at the regulations that this new commission comes up with, and then sit down with your zoning boards to figure out what direction you want to go, and then your council, your governing body, is going to have to make that decision on, yes, do you want them in your town or not? We will. You have to do it all over again.
Well,
Okay,
just to clarify, if you've already passed an ordinance permitting it, you should still check to make sure that all the things that you're permitted are actually outlined within this bill.
Yeah.
Because there might be other things it permits.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because remember, there's, until now, they didn't identify 4 different specific groups that could be dissected to be permitted. So you need to look at whatever language you've done, because if it hasn't addressed those specific licenses, you need to go back and readdress those licenses, because we have the option of picking any one of the 4, or all the 4, or none of the 4. So, yeah. So I think we had, Mayor, could you get my councilman right there for a minute? He's been raising his hand a couple of times. I want to give him a shot.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, gentlemen, for participating in this presentation tonight. I have 2 related home rule questions for clarification purposes that have very easy answers. The first one is simply this. We live in a Sterling district here, a 5-town district, and the legislature in its infinite wisdom is asked each of our municipalities, our mayors, and our councilmen to make the decision in deference to their constituency as to whether or not they're going to allow cannabis-related businesses locate in their towns. Let me throw an example out. Let's say Somerdale decides not to, but Stratford and Magnolia does. Is it not true that Somerdale would still logically suffer the same local social and enforcement problems as those towns that allow the businesses in their towns? Yes or no?
Answer?
It depends. Yes, potentially, but not as probably acute. So I'll give you an example. I mean, change if none of you do it, there's a home delivery provision in this bill. And you could still have cannabis delivered in your towns. But in terms of enforcement and driving under the influence, for
Correct,
example,
yeah.
you're dealing with it right now.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's my point. I
Yes.
just want to make sure that the attendees here tonight understand that, if they mount a petition effort to their mayor and council to prohibit cannabis industry in their municipalities, that they're not really going to erase the potential problems that could occur in their towns, and the sale and use in the other towns that those residents can go and buy and use in their hometown has nothing to do with whether or not a business is in their town.
And Councilman, you're exactly right, and I'll say this to you. The legislation reflects that in terms of how the funding flows. And Chief Check, you asked me this before. So the taxation piece is contingent upon you being a host community, right? The local taxation piece.
Precisely.
However, the money flow back that the chief just asked me about up there, about DREs and K-9 officers, is not contingent upon you being a host community, recognizing that every community in our state right now needs more DRE officers. Every community in our state, upon legalization, will have to deal with this K-9 problem. That money doesn't flow based on being a host community. That money flows based on the need to deal with that.
Thank you.
Thanks,
The
guys.
second part of my clarification question simply is this. If your town were to allow cannabis-related industries in your town, residents have to understand that those are businesses just like any other business, whether it be a Walmart or a Wawa or a McDonald's. And for those residents who are really concerned about their taxes, and of course we live in New Jersey, we're all concerned about our taxes.
Amen.
One of the consistent positive ways to impact their local taxes is to welcome businesses into the